Well, my name is Jonathan Woetzel. I'm a partner with McKinsey. I've been with the firm for 30 years. I've been here in China for 30 years. And today I'm going to talk to you about cities and urbanization because it's at this point kind of what I do. Over many years in McKinsey, I've done a lot of other things as well, so we could talk about that if you have interest. But I think this was an opportunity for me to share a bit around our thinking on what urbanization means, how it's changing China, and some implications for business and society. China with urban characteristics. I chose the title because, as you know, China has special characteristics. But I think China with urban characteristics is even going to be more special. That we really don't know what it looks like. China is the product of 5,000 years of village society and a Confucian hierarchy. And that's all changing. So we are losing the villages really fast. And with that transformation comes a change in not just the economy, but society and culture and health and religion and information and everything. So it's a whole new China. Now, it's not a clean sheet of paper. That's clear. Just the same way the Cultural Revolution did not achieve a clean sheet of paper. So there's a template here. But how is the traditional China, the village Confucian China, going to change with the density and frequency of interactions that comes with being in a city? Is a very unknown thing. It's very exciting. It's actually really hopeful, as I'll explain. I think this is the triumph of hope over centuries of experience. People are, particularly young people, believing that there is something that's better for them. And hence, we have migration and urbanization. And that is, I think, a tremendously optimistic kind of outlook for China. It can go wrong. It's clear that we can also make mistakes. And if there are too many mistakes at any point in time, we can have bad outcomes. We can stall. For me, Latin America is an example of how urbanization can go wrong. It started off with great promise, but it's clearly failed to reach the expectations and the hopes of people when they came to cities 40, 50 years ago in the case of Latin America. So another way of saying this is China the new Brazil? Or something better? So that's I think, where we are today. So now we have industrialization happening in China. And so it looks a little different, of course. It's not the printing mill or the textile machinery. It's somebody bent over a semiconductor assembly, or in this case, it looks like a textile line. And it's, of course, not just one person. That's a lot more. A lot more people are specializing in labor, specializing their labor and creating a modern economy. And because they're doing it later, they catch up faster. They leapfrog. So remember, in the UK example, it was 2 times richer. Well, in China, it's 3 times richer. When we move somebody from farm to factory, they create approximately 3 times the amount of value as they did in the agricultural sector. So that's the future. So we will have 30% of the world's economy in Chinese and Indian cities in the next 30 years. That's pretty exciting. That's the economic side of it. And because we're at a business school, I kind of start with that. But I actually think the transformation is much more fundamental than the economics. I think it's a lot more about people themselves and how they change. So in the decade of the 90s and the 2000s, China went from having 4 zones to having 400 zones. And we have economic development zones everywhere. And we also had a very rapid wave of industrialization around the cities to support those zones. Quite a bit of the industrialization that happened in the early 90s was all related to construction. And it's still most of what we see. So the heavy industries were built in the early 90s. now, where are we today? Because I think people are starting to say, can we continue to invest so much? Doesn't it need to make its transition? And yeah, sure, it does, and it will. And we're in that stage. We call it rebalancing. It's still all about the cities. And the first, we were investing to build the cities, and now we're using all of that investment to do whatever we want to do in those cities. We essentially want to consume. The investment is actually deferred consumption. When you build a building, the point was to fill it up with stuff. When you build a road, the point was to drive down the road. So investment turns into consumption. Either that or that was a really bad idea. And so somehow between 1990 and 2012, we urbanized 350 million people. Wow, bigger numbers have never been seen. And got another 300 million or so to go, up to the urban billion. It seems like we flip a switch when things start to urbanize. People say, isn't this historically different than anywhere else in the world? And the answer is actually no. Each and every year, China urbanizes about 1% of its population. That's the 15 to 20 million people. That's the same rate at which South Korea urbanized, which Taiwan urbanized. It's almost the same as what the UK did. It's very similar to what Germany did. It happened at a different time. The UK did that in 1750 to 1812 or 1830. India is kind of starting to do that now. That's where India is about 10 years into this. So maybe 5 to 10. Rough numbers. But it does seem like it's not entirely sort of economically driven. It's like somehow, why now? I mean, why all of a sudden do people want to move? Are they being pushed? Well, not really. China has actually got two things going for it that very few other places do. Anybody want to guess what are the two things that make China's urbanizations, if anything, more manageable than any other country in the world? It's quite unique to China. The one-child policy and land reform. China had the most equal land reform anywhere in the world starting in 1949. Accomplished at the point of a gun. Many landlords died. Land was split up very equally to very small plots across the country. People still have those pieces of paper. There's 60-year-old pieces of paper that say, this is what I received in my great redistribution of land. And the other thing is, of course, the one-child policy, which meant you didn't have overpopulation. You didn't have families of 15, where 14 of them knew they weren't going to be getting any of the land. So better go find something else. And that, again, didn't push people off the land. So it's interesting. So why did it start to urbanize? What was the light that went on that said, you got to get off the land, you got to move to the big city? That, for me, is actually a really interesting and somewhat unanswered question to date. But whatever it is, it seems to have created this tremendous dynamic, and it shows no sign of slowing down. If we believe it will continue, this is what we get. We get 1 billion people by the year 2030, about a quarter of the world's urban growth. As importantly, we get over 200 cities with 1 million population. That matters a lot for companies. Because if you have over 1 million people in a city, you can do some interesting things. You can build a metro. You can build world-scale airports. All the infrastructure businesses in the world care about China, because this is the only place that you can build so big. You also get some really big opportunities in marketing of consumer goods, because each city is effectively almost this, each cluster, let's say, is effectively a European country. And as a result, this becomes not a country that's urbanizing, but a continent. So 115,000 per capita in the city, not much change in the countryside. That's what's happening. So when we say we're going to improve the quality of life, we're going to improve rural incomes, we're going to solve the rural population, it's pretty clear. We're going to solve it by moving rural people to cities. there simply will be a much smaller problem. And now our real issue is how do we make those better cities? Today, we have 120 million people living in cities who don't technically have the right to live there. Not really, don't have documentation, can't send their kids to high school, barely able to send them to anything else. Did you know that Shanghai has 400 black primary schools? Wow. I mean, what's a black primary school? Well, that's an unofficial primary school. It's like, that's for migrant kids, and they're not officially licensed, and they don't have inspections, and safety is kind of questionable, but they're there. And the government is trying to shut down 300 of them and consolidate them into another 100 to make it better. And Shanghai's good. At least Shanghai's trying to solve the issues. But this is what people do when the system doesn't provide for them, and the kids need schools. So that's when it's 100 million people. You say, well, that's not good, obviously, but it's still only 10 or 15% of your population. When it's 400 million people, 40% of your population, that's not going to work. The same challenge that many countries in the history of the OECD and the history of urbanization have faced already. So this, in some ways, I would say, is going to have Chinese characteristics, but reflects a common challenge. Why are they moving? This is back to that why are they moving case. This is my best international chart. I put it together because I was asked to sort of explain urbanization in global context. And here I put on one axis is gender inequality, which represents women's rights to be represented in the political system, number of women in government offices, literacy, mortality, incidents of violence, you name it. So a big index that comes out of the UNDP. And on the other axis is urbanization. And you can see there's a relationship here. That as people move to cities, things get better. They become less unequal. Sort of a backwards way of saying it. And that's about access. And I think that's basically why they're moving. Because it allows people to reinvent themselves. They don't have to marry the same people that they were told they have to marry. They don't have to go to the same school. They don't have to have the same job. We really have very little choices in the countryside. Things are pretty much the same they've always been. Same people, same place, same ideas. That's why people are moving. They don't know what they're going to get, but it's different. And so in fact, they're giving something up. They're giving up their job. They're giving up their security. So who's moving anyway? Well, it's the young people. That's where we're going. I mean, those are some of the forces at work and how the changes are going to happen. We're going to see these massive economic shifts, great wealth being created in these cities. We're going to see a whole generational change from people who had a farming to now an urban background with a whole set of new expectations about who they are and what they might want to do. We're going to see a physical change on the order of magnitude which we've never seen anywhere in the history of mankind. So a very exciting moment. Already, many Chinese cities have as many consumers as major US ones. So that point about Chinese cities becoming rich, even if a few people in Chinese cities become rich, it's still a lot of people. So there's just a lot of money here. So there are as many wealthy households, disposable income above $40,000, adjusted by purchasing parity. So okay, a bit generous definition. But okay, middle class, comfortably well off, as many people in Shanghai as there are in San Francisco. Beijing is in Washington, Shenzhen as in Dallas, and it's only getting bigger. So you get the point. I mean, there's just a lot of money floating around China. On the other hand, we have some other problems. So on the far left, that's the average college graduation scene at a job-seeking office. China ramped up college graduates from 1 million a year to 7 million a year over the last 15 years. So a huge expansion in supply, not so much on demand. As a result, we think the average wage of the college graduates has declined in the last 5 years, and that the gap, the differential between a college and a high school or technical graduate is narrowing over time. Obviously, college graduates not so happy about that. The social system in China, we pretty much don't have one. If you get sick, it's kind of on you. China and the US share the common distinction of having the highest percentage of privately paid health care in the world. It's about 55% of healthcare is paid out of pocket, both in China and the United States. Fixing this is not easy. If you were to provide the same level of public service, the same number of teachers, the same number of healthcare workers, the same number of kindergartens to migrant kids and workers and people, non-hukou people, as you would to hukou people, it's a lot of money, about 2 or 3% of the GDP. That's a lot more than most cities have. So that money has to come from somewhere. Chinese cities, by and large, are not profitable, particularly smaller cities. By global standards, this is now starting to become embarrassing. As on the one hand, China is becoming rich, and everybody sees it. Everybody sees China's more competitiveness. Here we compare China 2005 versus 2010 on these different rankings. So the blue dots and the orange dots are 2005 to 2010. And on the economic stuff, things seem to be going better. China becomes more competitive, China becomes richer. When we start to look at other aspects like environment and society, not so good. The environmental performance index kind of going in the wrong direction, and the Gini coefficient, which is the ratio, as you I'm sure know, of the lowest income to the highest income, also going in the wrong direction. So nowhere near a European level, approaching the United States, and heading towards Brazil and South Africa. Not really a place you want to be. And that is where the cities conversation comes in, because the answer will not be found at the national level. There is no national solution to China's environmental issues, nor is there a solution to its employment challenge. Ultimately, the federal government cannot hire everybody, nor can it clean everything up. Local governments, cities, companies have to do that. And if that doesn't happen, well, the current trends are not so favorable. That's not the situation we can see as sustainable. And here's the way it pans out when you look at breakpoints. It seems like there's a breakpoint at somewhere between 7,000 GDP per capita and 10,000 GDP per capita. So up until 7,000 and 10,000, everything gets better faster. There's a rising trajectory. The sustainability goes up. And then at some point, it just flattens. And it doesn't get much better. That's where we are today. Most of Chinese cities are on that curve somewhere, and an increasing number have hit the breakpoint. So we looked at this for income per capita, and we said, okay, that's income. Is there anything else that's going on here? And we found a couple of interesting things. First of all, look at the population number. As cities get better, they get bigger. Or if they get bigger, they get better. It's correlated. We don't know if it's causal, but it's certainly correlated. So as they get up until a point, that point appears to be about 4.5 million. So over 4.5 million people in a city is basically the same. Everybody is now flat. So you're getting bigger, but nothing is particularly getting better. You're basically holding your own. Not getting worse particularly, but it's not going better. We think that about 20% of the urban population of China has passed the breakpoint. So 20% of cities, people living in cities, are no longer going to be able to rely on the blind faith that every year things will get better. Yes, our city may get bigger. Yes, it may get richer. Yes, there will be more people coming. No, my life may not be any better. That is the problem. So that is, I think, where we are now trying to understand what is it that the cities that are getting better, that's the averages again, some people are getting better, what are they doing differently? Ultimately, I think, comes down to management. The management of the city for sustainability is what differentiates the cities that are making progress from those that are from the average. Most Chinese cities basically have two sources of funding, central government allocated tax revenues and land sales. There really isn't anything else. So because they cannot borrow for the most part, plus they're not supposed to run a deficit, they can hold some cash, but they can't really run a deficit. This means they really do need more revenues because they otherwise are condemned to most of the services to Chinese citizens are obviously not provided by the federal government, they're provided by the cities. So to meet that deficit, they have to sell land. So in many cases, land sales accounts for, and this is gross land sales, over 50, 100%. So we've done some analysis around, what these real estate economics are driving Chinese cities. Because again, the government is trying to sell real estate. It's trying to sell a lot of land really fast. And if a developer comes in and promises them, I'll buy your land and I'll build these villas on it, very often we'll take that. Ultimately, we think that probably means a couple things. First of all, China will not wind up being megacities. With this kind of real estate-driven economics, it's very hard to see an outcome for China where 25% of the population lives in 10 large cities. Now, will China's urban China be 10 Tokyos? We don't think so. I mean, there'll be more, but that won't be the whole thing. In fact, we think, as you can see, that there'll be 8 to 10 megacities of over 10 million. It's a big number. It's 25% of the GDP. That's a pretty big number. And it's the cities that you would think. But it's not the whole thing. In fact, the much bigger piece of it is these medium-sized cities, medium-sized by Chinese standards, 1.5 to 5 million. But these medium-sized cities and the big cities are not separated. They're part of a cluster. So reality is that China is going to be this combination of large and medium-sized cities working together in a complementary way. So how does one help smaller cities? The best way to do that is to combine them with bigger cities, to connect them. So connect them physically, connect them with the companies, connect them with talent, and that's what we start to see. We start to see greater integration around clusters, whether it's by building highways and railways, by allowing universities to ally together. We see a lot of universities merging, and or by companies expanding, creating regional groups. What are some of these implications? So what are these cities that are doing better that sort of lead us to this, what I would always frame as a somewhat ultimately hopeful outcome? First big thing is public transit. China is now building the most metros that anybody's ever built, and there's over, I think, at least 30,000 kilometers of track being laid right now between metro and light rail across the country, which will connect about 100 million people. Secondly, service sector. A lot of people say, not enough people do. And a lot of this has to do with foreign investment, but over half the R&D in China is sponsored by multinationals. So there's cities that are able to attract multinational R&D centers, are also likely to be able to attract and build the service sector. Urban security networks. This is mostly about the pension and the healthcare funds. And so some cities that have been more aggressive in setting up their pension funds or managing them more professionally, not allowing city government officials to borrow from them to build buildings, which unfortunately, of course, happened here in Shanghai. That's obviously one of the things to do. Minimum wages, income subsidies, transfers. This has a lot to do with migrants. Waste management, an interesting one. Some cities really have made a big push on recycling, on waste-to-energy projects. Guangzhou, mayor calls himself the garbage mayor, and it's because he's made a big deal about this. So it was an interesting one. Emission controls, green auto usage. Well, this is getting a lot more play right now. I think it's more about the emission controls than it is about the auto, green auto at least. But yes, clearly some cities do better than others at controlling industrial-related pollution. And they usually do that by simply shutting down the factories or shutting off the power. And that's the most easiest way to do it, is increase the tariffing on power and now on water. So we'll see more of that. World-class events. Seems like every city in China has a world-class event, which means more or less like I've never seen so many varieties of plants, garden expos. Every city has a garden of this or a garden of that, the chrysanthemum expo, the hibiscus expo. I mean, it's amazing. So, but all it is about aggressive marketing of the city, creating an opportunity to bring talent to the city and define distinctiveness. And finally, yeah, this point about migrants. Because the whole idea around the city is a productivity machine. It's basically about taking people from the farm to the factory and to the office and tripling their productivity. So if you're able to do that effectively by bringing everybody into the loop, be a much more productive city. And that's the immigrant story everywhere in the world. So those are some of the management lessons that we take from top cities. All right, guys, that was 3 hours on cities. Thank you. Okay.